Hello and welcome to today's special PIR live event webinar during Science Odyssey Week for #XIPOP today. My name is Stacey Joyce and I will be your host. Remember, if you're joining us live, you can ask questions anytime throughout the webinar by clicking chat near the top left corner of your screen and typing in your question. Make sure that you do send that to all attendees as well as panelists. There's a drop-down menu there. And let us know where the question's coming from. You can give us a student name if it's from one student, or maybe just what school you're joining from, or even what city. And we would be happy to give you a shout out when we ask your question. We also have a very special class with us live on camera today that we'll hear from during the Q&A. So I'm going to give them a chance to say hello to you. We have Ms. Young's grade 5-6 students from Burnley Trail. They're very excited. Wonderful. That was some excellent energy. They are from Burnley Trail Public School in Toronto, Ontario. So we're so glad you could be with us. And I'm going to now turn it over to our guest for today. Our special guest is David Lloyd, who has a master's in biochemistry and is now the CEO and co-founder of FredSense Technologies. So I will turn it over to you, David.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Stacey. Hello, everybody. Really excited to be here with you today to chat a little bit about water, some of the most important stuff that we have on our planet. We're going to have a lot of fun. We're going to go through some information, talk a little bit about why water is important. Just a little bit about me. I am a biologist. I like to play with bacteria during the day and do all sorts of fun and interesting stuff in getting bacteria to sense different chemicals that are found in our environment. And the companies that FredSense that I'm going to talk about came out of the University of Calgary. So I'm out of Calgary, Alberta. And when I was a student, myself and some of my co-founders were looking at ways that we could impact water quality and help keep our environment safer and cleaner. So really excited to share this with you. We've got a great activity. So I'm going to just start with some overview information on water, because water is everywhere, but we don't really know oftentimes where it comes from and why it's super important. So let's talk a little bit about that, and then we can jump into some cool science that we can do together today. So we talk about water a lot, but we oftentimes take it for granted because it's so abundant, it's all around us, it's stuff that we can use in our day-to-day lives, but we really oftentimes don't appreciate how much water we use. We use it for so many different things. We use it for cooking, we use it for cleaning, we use it when we take a shower. But there's lots of other ways that we use all of this water that we can find in our environment. Water is one of the most heavily used resources in industry. So when you're getting that gas out of the ground and getting it to the pump station so it can go into your car, that's a really water intensive process. So we use a lot of water there. And whenever we're watering our grass or we're watering the vegetables that we like to grow in our gardens, that's using water all the time too. In fact, each one of us, just to give you some statistics, a Canadian on average uses 329 liters of water every single day. So I want you to think about that. That's a lot of water, right? We use that in all sorts of different ways. Think about how we use water in the morning. We turn on our taps to brush our teeth. We use water to drink from. We run our dishwashers, our washing machines, we're watering our grass, all sorts of things. We use a lot of water every day. So how much is 329 liters of water? That's about 150 bottles of Coca-Cola. That's a lot. I want you to think about that. That's on the shelf at the grocery store. You've seen these 2-liter bottles. Think about what 150 of them would look like. That's a lot of water. So we really need to be able to make sure that the water that we have access to is clean and that we can use it and that it can do all of these things that we love it to do in our lives. But water comes from, so the big question then is, where does our water come from? And there's two primary sources of where we get our water that comes out of our taps that we ultimately drink and do all these things with. There's surface water, or water that's found on the ground or in the mountains or in trees or in the air. And then there's groundwater, which is water that's actually hidden beneath the surface, that in these things that we call aquifers. So these big collections of water that's kind of trapped underground that we can tap into and pump up to be able to get it. So water comes from all sorts of places. Where can we get the water that we drink and use? It can come from lakes, it can come from rivers, streams. It can be melting on the top of mountains. It can come from precipitation. So when it rains or when it snows, that water can accumulate. And these are all things that we can grab in order to get it into our pipes. And a lot of this water is constantly moving around. So a big job that people have in the world is trying to figure out how to manage all of the water that we have into our disposal, and how can we get it to the cities and communities that are going to use a lot of this water all the time. Well, the problem is, it's not just a matter of taking that water from the environment and putting it into a pipe and taking it to your faucet. Oftentimes, there's a lot of stuff that can be bad for us that's found in environmental water. You know, it's just like how when someone says, don't drink water from the pool, or don't drink ocean water. All these different forms of water have something in it that we don't want to consume, but maybe we can use it in different ways. So it's a big challenge that it's not just about finding all the water that we need to use on a day-to-day basis, but how can we get it to our homes in a really clean way? So that's a lot of what we think about, and a lot of our cities have spent years and years putting technology together to be able to make that environmental water clean enough for us to drink. So oftentimes what we'll do is all of these different sources of water, this surface water, groundwater, the lakes and streams, will get pumped to a drinking water plant, to a treatment plant. And what happens there is this huge amount of water gets cleaned up so that all the stuff that might be bad about it is removed, and it can go to our homes so that we can drink it and use it every day. And this is just a picture of one of the water treatment plants that's found in Calgary. This is the Glenmore Water Treatment Plant. So it's a really big facility, and it's one of the main facilities that feeds all the drinking water for the city. And it uses a ton of water in our environment. So I want you to think about how I said that every day we use about 300 liters of water. This facility produces 950 megaliters of water every day for us to be able to drink and use. That's 950 million liters. That is a lot of water that needs to get processed and cleaned. It's a very, very big job in all of our cities to be able to make all of this awesome water that we can use every day. So a big question always, because it's very costly to be able to clean up this water and to be able to get it to a place where we can drink it, is what are all those things inside of water that are really, really bad for us to consume or use? And how can we know if water is safe to drink and it's not? This is a really important thing when we're grabbing all this water from the environment. So we use a whole bunch of different methods to figure out what water is good for us to drink and which water is bad. So we're going to talk about, first of all, some stuff that we call the physical aspects of water. These are things like the temperature of the water. How hot is it? How cold is it? Is it a temperature that we can consume that way? What does it look like? What's the color? Oftentimes we can use color as an indicator of, is there something potentially bad in the water that we might not want to put in our bodies? How is the taste or the smell? This is something that drinking water treatment plants care a lot about, because water might be okay for us to drink, but if it tastes or smells funny, oftentimes we don't want to drink it. And the two things that we're going to talk about today are super important aspects of water chemistry and understanding when water is good for us to drink and it's not. The first one is pH. How acidic or basic is the water? And what that means is it's kind of like baking soda and lemon juice. Lemon juice is really sour, and things that are really sour are acidic. They've got a low pH. They've got this sort of soury, can almost burn your skin if it gets too low on the pH side. And on the opposite side is something that's basic. It's a high pH. And these are things like baking soda, or can even burn in a different way, becoming caustic and stuff like that. So we have to make sure that the pH of our water is something that our body is going to be okay with. And so we're going to do a little bit to discover that today. The other thing that we often measure in water is something called turbidity. Turbid water means essentially that there's a bunch of stuff in it that prevents you from being able to see through it. It becomes opaque is another way to say it. So that when you look through that water, there's solids or different materials that prevent you from really seeing straight through that water. And water is clear, so this is a way that a lot of water operators can quickly understand, is there something in our water that maybe was picked up from the environment that could be bad for us? So this is why water is so important to our lives, and why we need to be looking at understanding what's in our water so that when it ultimately hits our tap, we can have confidence that we can drink it. So I'm going to pass it over to Ben and Kat, who's going to take you through a little bit of an activity that some of you might be doing live with us, or that you can do later on.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, David. I'm going to jump in, as I guess is my prerogative as the host. I just wanted to draw everyone's attention to the activity. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here just for a moment before we hop over to Ben and Kat. So David, maybe you can tell me, can you see that PDF that I'm showing on my screen? Perfect. I got a thumbs up there. So this is the activity that I hope you have in front of you if you're doing the activity with us, or you may see later on, or maybe you've already done the activity before we're getting to it. I just wanted to pop on here because we're going to run through the second activity B with pH with you, but for the most part, we're going to let you analyze and filter your own water. Perhaps you got it from a pond nearby or a local stream or creek. So you can see the images here. I'm just going to leave that and stop scrolling for a minute. So you've got this image here, and that's how you're going to set up your coffee filter. So you are going to put your coffee filter inside of your cup and put the edges over the sides and use your rubber band to hold it there. And then you can eventually filter through there. But before you do, you need to do this little step here of taping your Secchi disc to the bottom of another cup so that you can see it through the bottom of your cup. So now I'm going to turn it over to Ben and Kat just so they can show you that a little bit with putting the Secchi disc on the bottom of the cup. And so I'm going to go ahead and unmute. So we should be able to hear you now. Ben and Kat, how are you doing in London, Ontario?
We're doing good, thank you.
Excellent. Well, I'll let you take it away, just demonstrating where that Secchi disc gets placed.
Okay, so we're going to show you how to attach the Secchi disc. And I found the best way to do this is if you start with the cup upside down on the table, and then you're going to want to take your cutout of your Secchi disc with it facing down, so you'll be able to see it when you look through the cup. And once you've got it in position, all you need to do is take a couple pieces of tape and attach it. Make sure it's not moving anywhere. And then when you turn the cup around, you'll be able to see the Secchi disc inside, and that's what you use to test the water clarity.
Wonderful. Thank you. I'm not going to lie. I hadn't thought of turning it upside down. That's wonderful. So once you have attached your Secchi disc, you can take your sort of dirty water and then just start pouring it in a little bit at a time. And you're going to just keep checking if you can still see that Secchi disc. And the minute that you have enough water in there that you can't see it anymore, making sure nothing's settled out, if you do have things floating in the water or kind of mixed in, just swirl that cup to keep them mixed in. And then measure the height in your cup of how high the water needed to be before that Secchi disc becomes essentially invisible underneath. So what I want to do is give you a minute to complete that, and maybe we can go back to David to just talk about if you know or could give us, actually I have a few questions queued up. I was going to ask you about the turbidity of the water, but why don't I ask our student questions that they're waiting for their answers. The very first one has nothing to do with water in particular, but the grade 6s at Midnapore School in Calgary are wondering where in Calgary you went to school.
So I'm not actually from Calgary. I'm from a community in Alberta called Medicine Hat. And I was actually homeschooled. So I worked with one of the school boards there, and we met up with a lot of the other homeschool kids there when I was going through my grade school. And I only recently moved to Calgary to do my master's. So I did my undergrad in Edmonton and then moved down to Calgary later on in my life.
Wonderful. And now you stayed in Calgary and started up your company there, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. So we'll talk more about that a little later. Dalton at Midnapore is wondering, do you think we'll ever run out of water, and what would we do?
Dalton, that's a really good question, and it's pretty topical right now. So there's a bunch of different things in the world that people are worried about. And the water shortage or water crisis is something that oftentimes gets talked about. I've been able to go down to California, and oftentimes we take for granted how plentiful water is here in Canada. They have a major water shortage right now. So water is very, very top of mind. So I want you to think about if you've ever gone to a restaurant and the waiter always offers you water. Down in a lot of places in California, you have to ask for water to be served in the restaurant because it's a really big concern for them. So it's something that we're definitely talking about and worried about. And what would we do if we started running out of water? Well, that could be a big thing for a lot of people. So what we're doing is oftentimes coming up with new technologies to be able to find water from different places. There's a new technology that creates clean drinking water from ocean water that's getting used quite a bit. It's a process called desalination, removing the salt from that ocean water so that we can drink it. So we've got lots of water around that we can definitely use to make sure that we don't hit that sort of situation where we might run out of water.
Right. And you talked a lot about water treatment in municipalities for our drinking water that comes out of our taps. We have a question from Ms. Bancardo's grade 5/6s at St. Nicholas wondering, what does the water tower have to do with this process?
That's a great question. And so water towers are really important, particularly in smaller communities, as a way of storing water. Because a lot of times we don't use water all the time. The amount of water that we need during the day might change. We might need more during the morning and then less in the mid-afternoon and then more in the evening when we get home. All of those sorts of things. So water towers are really important for us to be able to store water for when we need it later. So it's an incredibly good way for us to store and distribute water, particularly over large areas. So you might see some of those in smaller communities, but in bigger communities, they have the same things, just big, big tanks for storing a lot of water in different places.
Right. And another question on that municipal water treatment thought, we had a question from Gilby, who is wondering how much chlorine is in the water that goes through the Calgary system. I don't know if you would have that answer or a ballpark or any context there.
So I cheated a little bit because I saw that question come in. And so I went to the drinking water guidelines because I didn't know off the top of my head how much was actually there. So to give you the scientific number, it's about 1 milligram per liter of chlorine that's found in our water. And chlorine is really important because it's used as an antiseptic and disinfectant chemical. So what it does is it cleans out and kills off a lot of the bacteria. So it's a really great way for us to make sure that we don't have microorganisms that end up in our water. So sometimes the water in Calgary versus other places where you might get it, you'll taste a little bit of that, what almost tastes like that chlorine-y that chlorine-y taste. And that tiny little bit that you're tasting is residual chlorine that's left over from the treatment process. And that's very low. That's not something that is considered harmful or concerning, but it can affect the taste a little bit for the water that we have in Calgary.
Wonderful. So I think I'm going to pause our questions there. We do have a couple questions about bacteria in the water, and I promise we will get to them. But we're going to continue with our activity for a little bit here. So I'm going to go back to sharing my screen and just making sure we've gone through these steps. If you are following along, that you were able to measure that height in your cup when you could no longer see your Secchi disc. And then once you've done that, to pour all the water through your filter and let that filter through while we're continuing on with other discussion and the other part of the activity, because sometimes that can take a little while to go through the filter. And if you try to force it through, you can break your filter, and then all the stuff you're trying to get out of your water will be stuck back in your water at the bottom of the cup. So be gentle with those filters so that you don't have to go through the steps all over again. But for now, I think that if that is going through the filter okay, then we should be ready to move on to the pH testing part of the activity. So I am going to turn it back over to Ben and Kat because they are all set up to run through that activity with you. So I'll stop sharing and stop talking, and then I'll turn it over to Ben.
Thanks, Stacy. So we're going to be using our cabbage indicator solution. And the cool thing about this is it actually changes color depending on whether your water is acidic or basic. So we've got 3 samples out in front of us, and we're going to be putting the indicator into each of them, and seeing if we get a color change, and if we get a color change, whether it's an acid or a base. So I'll start with the first one, and I'll let you have a good look at that before I add the indicator to it. And as we can see, there's not really much of a change. It looks about the same as it was before. So that would be an indication that it's probably a neutral pH, which is about what our tap water is. So this would be something that is safe to drink. So I'll let Kat do the second one. And the second one's actually quite clear if you can see it well. And now we have a really nice blue color. I'm actually going to put a piece of paper behind it so that you can see it a bit better.
And I would just suggest that you even turn it so the label's on the side for us, and we'll be able to see that color a little bit better. Wonderful. And can we see number 1 in the same way just to compare?
Sure. So here's number 1 again.
That's not as nice a color.
No, it's not nearly as nice. So would you like to do the third sample now? So again, we're starting with a clear solution. Wow, that's nice. So we got a really dark red color this time.
Yeah, I don't even think the paper's great, but that one's so clear.
Oh, I know. This one's very
so obvious. It's not necessarily clear. So wonderful. So we can see the 3 different colors there. And what I'm going to do is share our comparison here on the screen. In case you don't have the instructions right in front of you, you can see here that we have calibrated solutions. Someone had measured, the pH equals 1 of this solution, and that is the color that you get from red cabbage indicator when the pH equals number 1. So when you are doing this activity in your own classroom, you'll be able to compare to the colors on this sheet, or you can even Google for red cabbage indicator in case you have a black and white sheet, and you can see that on a computer screen. And so the pH of the first solution was right in that blue range, a little purplish, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And then our solution number 2, we got a very nice blue color over here by, I think, about pH 9. And number 3 was definitely nowhere in this range. We were all the way down towards about pH 2 or 3, I think, with that one. So you can definitely see the difference between these solutions, and those those three solutions, one of them was a little bit colored at the beginning, but the other two were completely clear and colorless. And yet they look just like water, but are obviously not pure water. So just an example of how looks can be deceiving, especially when we're talking about water quality. So from there, you can take any leftover cabbage indicator solution that you might have. You can potentially test a water source somewhere else nearby, or you can make some solutions and hypothesize whether they are acids or bases or neutral, and test a few other things perhaps if you have time and materials left over. For now, I think we have more questions coming in, and we certainly have more to talk about with David Lloyd, who we mentioned is the CEO and co-founder of FredSense Technologies. So I think we need to hear a bit more about what that is and what it has to do with this discussion in water quality. So I'll turn it back over to you, David.
Awesome, thanks. So we talked a little bit about why water is important generally, how we put it through these treatment plants, and some of the physical things that we look at. And Stacy made that great comment that looks can be deceiving when it comes to water. Just because it looks like it might be dirty doesn't always mean it is. And sometimes it looks nice and clean and clear, and there's actually things that could be harmful in it. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about some of those things that you can find inside of water that can not always be the nicest stuff to encounter. So there's two types of things that are really, really difficult for us to detect and see that's found inside of our water. The first one are chemicals. And so the big problem with chemicals is that even if you try to filter them, oftentimes they're dissolved in the water. So it will come with the water through the filters. And you need special or unique ways of being able to get these compounds out. So some of the things you might have heard of before, which can be harmful to us, are oftentimes naturally occurring. They're found inside of the rocks that are found in the environment. So we need to be careful where we get our water. So a big one you might have heard of is lead. So lead used to be used in things like paints and other materials a long time ago. And then we discovered that it was actually something that at very, very small amounts could be harmful to us. And you might have heard in the news in different places that sometimes lead can be found in our drinking water, and it's a really big concern. So that's something that we need to be able to make sure isn't there. Other chemicals too, like copper or mercury, arsenic or cadmium, are other chemicals that can be really concerning in our drinking water, and they're very hard to detect. So to give you an idea, when we talked about chlorine, I said there was about 1 milligram of chlorine in every liter of water. So that sounds like a tiny amount. 1 milligram is like a grain of salt in that liter of water, in that Coca-Cola bottle that we talked about. These chemicals are toxic at a part per billion, not just 1 milligram, but even a tinier 1/1000th of that amount can be really, really bad for you in your water. So that means that it's very, very hard to detect some of these chemicals that are found there. The other things that are not good oftentimes in our water are bacteria and viruses. These are the microbes, the organisms that live in water. Many times, most of these viruses and bacteria are not harmful to humans, but there are a few kinds that are especially harmful for us that can be found in water. So one of the big ones that is often associated with our drinking water is E. coli. So you might have had this happen to you in your community, or you might have heard of one of these, but there have been these boil water advisories that sometimes go out. And what they're advising is that sometimes during the treatment process, there are problems and bacteria can end up in our water and it can make people sick. So we can boil or use chlorine or all these other different methods to try to get rid of those bacteria so that our water can be clean for us to be able to use. So there's a bunch of other things that oftentimes are very hard for us to get rid of. And bacteria can't always be filtered just using one of a typical kind of filter that's there that will get rid of sediment, because they're so tiny. So you need special filters. We call them ultra filters that are super small so that it catches all of the bacteria and all of the viruses that might pass through water. So you can see these in a lot of water treatment systems. They'll have these big kind of filter looking things where they push the water through a membrane, just like you did in the activity, but that will get rid of the bacteria and viruses that can be found in the environment. So this is a really important step for us to make sure that we get rid of these types of chemicals. So I think another big question too is, where do these sort of things come from? So I talked a lot about how there's these chemicals and bacteria that can just be naturally found, but we also have a lot of activities that result in these chemicals becoming abundant in our water. So there's waste potentially from manufacturing plants. So things that end up in our water supply when we're producing different chemicals or compounds, and we need to make sure that they get treated. There's runoff from agricultural pesticides, herbicides, or different types of fertilizers that are used in agriculture. So if you're growing corn or radishes or whatever it is you're growing, oftentimes these farmers are putting different chemicals on their crops, and that can end up in our water supply. So we need to clean those out. Gasoline and different types of oils can be found in a lot of industrial processes, or we can have accidental leaks. There's animal waste products, and even drugs are becoming a really big issue in our water supply. So if you've ever gotten sick and had to get some pills or antibiotics or something from a doctor, every time these antibiotics get flushed down the toilets or put into our environment in some way, it can end up in our drinking water supply. So that can be really harmful for us for a bunch of reasons, but a big one being that these are things that can end up in our body when we don't want them to be. So there's a bunch of different sources that all of these can come from. And because water moves around a lot and it evaporates and turns into clouds, it can take a lot of these chemicals with it. So even though there's an industrial plant that might be in one place, some of that contaminated water can pass to other areas, and through rain and air pollution, it can end up in other parts of our system. So we need to always be really cognizant of understanding what's in our water and how we can clean it up. So there's a little bit of a problem today in really understanding water quality. We talked about a couple examples here, and like I said, measuring things like pH and turbidity, those are really awesome ways for us to get started. But a lot of these chemicals are very hard to analyze. And the way that we do it today is that we send someone out to wherever the water is. You take a big sample. You take a 2-liter Coke bottle, essentially. You fill it up with water, and you send it to a place called an analytical lab. An analytical lab has all of this really expensive, high-tech equipment that we can use to figure out what's in this water, because it's so hard to be able to figure out all of these tiny little contaminants that could be harmful to our health. So what this means for a lot of water utilities, or to the people who drink the water, is that it takes a lot of time to be able to get that information. Sometimes communities are waiting 3 to 5 days to understand if there's something harmful in their water. In the meantime, that water can end up into our system. So contamination can be missed, which is a really big problem, and we need better ways to be able to solve this. So that's what myself and my team are doing at FredSense. So we're looking at new ways to be able to understand very quickly what are the different contaminants that you can find in water. And so we've built a system that we call FRED, and FRED stands for the Field Ready Electrochemical Detector. So FRED is a box, and what this box does is it helps you understand your water quality. And the key to it is that we're taking a very different approach to understanding water chemistry. We take bacteria, not the bad kinds of bacteria that can be harmful to us, but bacteria that are found naturally in the environment that are able to respond to a bunch of different chemicals, and we train them to be able to sense the chemicals we want and produce electricity when they're there. So what these bacteria do is they're floating around in the water and they go, oh, I just came around to some arsenic. I'm going to produce this electrical signal so that I can tell when that arsenic is there. So that allows us to build these boxes that use bacteria to be able to quickly understand if these contaminants are there. So instead of having to take 3 to 5 days to get that information and potentially have an event where you miss some water that is harmful, this is something that anyone can use. It's incredibly simple. It uses these trained bacteria to sense chemicals in our environment. This is a picture of one of our first prototypes. And I don't know, Stacey, can everyone still see my screen?
So if you want to show something in front of your webcam, I would just suggest hitting the red stop share button and then restarting after you. There we go. Now we'll be able to see it larger.
Hopefully you can all see me now. So this is one of our new boxes. So this is one of our field kits. So this is Fred, the detector. And inside of it is everything that you need in order to be able to do one of your measurements. And it's really, really simple. So I'll just take one of these out. So this is a cartridge. You fill this up with water. So the bacteria are inside of it. And then what you do is you just slot it into one of these little detector things here. So you just fill it up with water. You don't do anything else. You close it and you press the green button. And then in about an hour, it tells you how much arsenic or different types of chemicals can be found in your water. So it's a portable, we call it a portable field kit for doing water analysis.
So you said 1 hour instead of 3 to 5 days, which was the other option.
Yeah, exactly. So we see it's going to as something that's going to have a really big impact on the water community, because now we can get better, more reliable information, and we can know what to do when we have problems with our water. And so what we're really focused on is finding new bacteria that we can train for a bunch of different types of chemicals. So our big sensor that we have right now that's being adopted by utilities is for arsenic, and arsenic that's found in groundwater, so that they can know how much arsenic they need to treat on a daily basis and make sure that there isn't any that ends up in the drinking water supply. But there's lots of other stuff we can detect. Things like ammonia and nitrates, which are oftentimes found in agriculture, or a lot of those food products, or different types of chemicals that are found from pesticides, herbicides, pharmaceuticals, all those sorts of things. And we can test in a bunch of different types of water. So everything from tap water to industrial water to different food and beverage applications. So we're trying to build a really broad platform for doing this sort of analysis. So that's all I've got to say. I'm really excited to answer your questions. I hope I was able to tell you a little bit more about what we're really passionate about. We'd be happy to answer any questions about what it's like to be an entrepreneur, about water, or anything else. And hope you had fun. So I'll pass it back to you, Stacey.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for showing us Fred. I was very interested in meeting Fred today, so now I can check that off my to-do list. Now I'd like to go to our live classroom. They've been waiting so patiently. So I am going to unmute Ms. Young's class in Toronto. And Ms. Young, perhaps you can choose one of your students to ask a question.
Sure. Why not? So we have Sahirshan here.
Wonderful. Hello.
Hi.
You can go ahead and ask your question when you're ready.
Do ultrafilters filter microbeads?
Sorry, can you say that one more time?
Do ultrafilters filter microbeads?
Oh, that's a really good question. So yes, most ultrafilters will filter out microbeads or nanoparticles. So just for so everybody knows, there are a lot of these tiny, tiny little particles, and oftentimes made up of plastic that gets left over in water, that become really, really hard to filter out. And many water treatment plants don't use those types of ultrafilters that are going to be able to get these nanoparticles out of their water. It's a big thing that actually a lot of groups are starting to talk about, is that we need to find better ways to be able to filter out those compounds as it's becoming more of a concern. But a lot of the really high-tech ultrafilters that are coming out are capable of getting rid of those compounds. That's a great question.
Wonderful. And what I'm going to do, David, is ask you if you can stop the sharing now. We've had the slide up, I think, long enough. If anyone wanted that email, they hopefully have it. And if not, you can always contact us. We'll be able to put you in contact with David. And I would like to go back to Ms. Young's class for another question. So I'll unmute you again. And when you're ready, we'd love to hear what you are wondering.
Oh, sorry. Can we get Pamela? Come on. Okay, go ahead.
So my question is, how much bacteria do you guys find every day in your water?
So we don't detect any bacteria using our sensors, but oftentimes we find almost none of the harmful bacteria in our drinking water supply. That's something that our water plant operators do a really good job of making sure that we don't have a lot of these really bad species of organisms that can hurt us in our water. So that's something that we spend a lot of time on. So what we detect are things like the arsenic and different types of chemicals that are harder to be able to measure because you have to get them at such a low concentration.
Wonderful. So I am going to give Ms. Young's class a minute to come up with the next question there. And in the meantime, I am going to ask a question on behalf of the students in grade 5 at Eden Rose. And they're wondering how water can get too acidic or too basic.
That's a great question. So one example of how this can happen is that different chemical compounds that are found in our environment, if they end up in water, they can change the pH. So you might have heard of something called acid rain, where there's sulfur compounds from air pollution that can accumulate in our clouds. And then when it starts to precipitate, when it starts to rain, a lot of this water will have all of the sulfate compound inside of it. And that makes it very, very acidic. So that's one example of how it can happen. Other ways is that it can be naturally occurring. A lot of rocks have properties that make the water more basic or acidic, or different industrial processes.
Wonderful. And I'm going to follow that up with one more question from Eden Rose. They are wondering what happens if you drink pool water by accident?
Well, if you drink a little bit of pool water, you're probably okay. There's nothing in pool water that's going to be really, really toxic to you. But you're not going to want to drink a whole bunch of it because there's a lot of stuff in pool water that's designed to be there because we're bathing in it. There's a bunch of people there. So we want to make sure that we kill off sort of the bad stuff, the bacteria and everything that would be there, and keep the water really clean. So there's some extra stuff that's found in a lot of pool water that we don't want to necessarily put in our bodies. But if you get a little in your mouth, you're going to be okay.
Wonderful. So I think we're ready to go back to Ms. Young's class. And who has our next question there?
How do you train bacteria?
Oh, that's a great question. So what we do is my background's in biochemistry, but what I am is a genetic engineer. So what we've been able to figure out is we've been able to go into organisms inside of these bacteria and figure out how they work. All the bacteria have DNA, and it's kind of like a blueprint that tells us how the bacteria functions. So what we do is we find special bits of DNA that give these bacteria the ability to sense a chemical. And we stick it inside of the bacteria, we put it inside of their DNA, and what we now do is we give that bacteria the ability to sense this new chemical compound. So when we train them, what we're sort of doing is giving them a new superpower, giving them an ability that they didn't have before using DNA.
Wonderful. Well, I am going to put a question in today as well because none of the students have asked, but I would like to know, and I'm sure they'd like to know once I ask, hopefully, what has it been like going from the role of scientist, doing your master's, doing research in a lab, genetically engineering these bacteria, and transitioning to being an entrepreneur and taking that and making it into this commercial product you showed us that is now a real, tangible, green plastic case with all the components that you can now provide to anyone who has some water testing needs? What has that process looked like?
So when I was doing my master's, I'm a nerd, and I'm sure you can figure that out from the way I'm talking, but I love video games and science and board game, all that kind of stuff. So I was very passionate about going to school and wanting to learn how we can use biology in new and interesting ways. And when I did my master's, you spent a lot of your master's researching, making a hypothesis and going down and researching if that hypothesis is right and then trying to get data. And one thing afterwards that myself and some of my other co-founders found was that this was awesome to do, but it wasn't making a real impact on the world. It was, sort of in the lab. The project that I was doing was going to do some incredible things down the road. I was working in cancer biology. It was a lot of fun to be contributing to that. But I really wanted to do something tangible that I could really have my hands in and see the difference that was being made right away. And it was because of that we decided, hey, we have this really great idea and this technology that we can use bacteria in a new way. Why don't we try turning that into a company? And it was a very sort of daunting experience where we really didn't know what we were doing, but it was a ton of fun because we got to learn how could we take this idea and turn it into something real. And I found that incredibly rewarding. And I hope that it's a bit of a testament to any type of person can be an entrepreneur, even a scientist or a researcher. It really doesn't matter where you come from. If you have a great idea and you want to make something new, you can make that happen.
Wonderful. So if any of our students out there who are watching would like to pursue this someday, do you have any advice for them? We had many grade 5, 6 classes joining us today, maybe up to grade 9. They've got a little ways before they have to make these career choices. What would you give them as advice for now?
I think try to learn as much as you can about as many different things that you can. If you think you might be interested in something, go try it. I started out my undergrad wanting to be a medical doctor, but I never actually shadowed a doctor before. And when I shadowed this doctor in my 3rd year of my undergrad, I was almost through my degree, I realized that was something I never wanted. And so I had to go and sort of figure out what is it that I should go do with my life and where am I going to go? And it was getting involved with a bunch of different people that weren't like me, artists, social scientists, engineers, people that weren't doing science, that made me think about what are the things I really like to do and what are the things I didn't. And if I hadn't gone out and sort of explored all of these different opportunities, just, had that one singular path, that I think my life would have turned out really different. So never be afraid to try something new, to explore something. I don't think you have to know exactly what it is you want to do, but find something that you are passionate about and pursue it for a bit. And then go see if there are other things that you love to do too, and how you can incorporate those in what you're doing now.
Thank you so much. Time and time again, I hear this story from the experts we feature here about the zigzagging career path that puts you at the sort of even midpoint, say, of your career. You're by no means at the end of your career, but it's not at all where you were headed when you left your K-12 schooling, for example, and that's common and that's okay, and you figure it out along the way. So thank you for the great advice for our students and for answering all of our questions today.
No worries. Thanks so much for having me, and I hope everybody had fun.
And I am going to also give a shout out to our helpers in the Partners in Research office, Ben and Kat, who demonstrated the activity for us today. Thank you so much for all your help.
No problem, Stacy.
And we need to say thank you and a goodbye to our class, Ms. Young's class in Toronto. I'll unmute you so you can give us a send-off as well. Yep, I figured you guys win for the loudest and most energetic send-off of the day. Thank you so much for joining us live and asking such great questions. And I hope that you had fun with us today, learned a little bit, and will join us again. Tomorrow, we are doing 2 more live events for Science Odyssey. One will be on water quality, but tied to the bad bacteria in water, and how they're sort of growing resistant to the ways that we try to get rid of them. And also, we are going completely different away from water quality to discuss forensic science, and we'll be talking about blood stains and how forensic scientists can get clues about what has happened at a crime scene from the blood stains. So thank you again for tuning in today. We hope to see you again on another PIR live event. You can find more information at pirweb.org. All right, have a great one, everybody. Bye-bye.